Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the track session of day 2 of the DSCI Best Practices Meet. I sincerely hope that you found the first half of today's agenda useful and fruitful. So this particular track session is dedicated to discussing a very niche and upcoming topic, which is AI operations. Right, organizations are increasingly moving towards adoption of AI operations, and in this we are today deliberating what should be the coding ethics when it comes to AI operations. So, in order to discuss the topic, I have two preeminent experts with me. First, let me invite Ms. Manisha Singh, Engineering Manager, AIOps. Can we have Manisha on stage? Welcome, Manisha. Next, we have Mr. Mrinal Chakrabarti, Director for Solution Engineering, Pactra Edge. Welcome, Mrinal. So, over to both of you. Yes, you are absolutely visible. Video feed is working perfectly. So, over to both of you for the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Aditya.
Can you all see? Right. So thanks a lot, DSCI, for having us here. Today, Mrinal and I are going to talk about coding ethics, AIOps, when operations are increasingly augmented by AI. Now, in this talk, before we dive into the ethics part, we will first talk about what AIOps is all about, how it benefits us, moving from traditional IT operations to intelligent IT operations. Then we talk about the risks involved using this technology, and then ultimately how to mitigate these risks and the best practices. Now, I would start with sharing this image. Can any one of you relate to this? This image is a typical log file that many support teams and developers have struggled reading manually line by line to solve an outage. Such was the time of traditional IT operations where the process used to be very time consuming. Correlation between different layers of the platform could not happen, and the results could differ, and the validation and the results could, the solution only lasted for a particular moment in time. History could not be recorded, and these were the challenges of those times. Besides this, there were a lot of resources that were utilized over very long investigation calls to solve a particular problem, and then all these infra teams, support teams, developer teams, they used to they used to gaze at so many dashboards and monitoring tools, wondering where to start. So in such traditional IT operations, we used to follow a reactive approach, wherein, for example, we would wait for a particular, let's say, a CPU threshold to breach a 80% mark before we could act. Imagine a scenario where, what if we could leverage the power of logs, so that we don't really have to read all these logs, and we can let the machine, we can allow the machine to do all the trend analysis for us. What if the machine could actually predict a fault for us? Let's say tomorrow at 8 p.m., your platform would face a CPU outage, right? Isn't it? Such is the power of AIOps. And AIOps means artificial intelligence for IT operations. AIOps uses AI to simplify IT operations and then accelerate the automation to automate the problem resolution in this entire complex IT landscape. It can predict and prevent anomalies much before a user is impacted. It can also create baselines of normal behavior and alert you in case there's some deviation from this normal baseline. It can also provide you automated root cause analysis to your problems, so we exactly know where to narrow down on the problem area. This greatly reduces the mean time to resolve issues, and in turn, it also helps reduce the resources that are utilized, to solve such outages and problems. So as we transition from traditional IT operations to these intelligent IT operations, this thing AIOps has taken human and machine collaboration to a next level. So such is the time where humans and machines are not just coexisting, but we are collaborating and working together like team members.
So when we really look at AIOps theology, we will understand that from what Manisha was referring to as reactive ways of dealing with problems in looking at logs, we have now looking at a very intelligent way of looking at logs. Look at the point three upwards. We are looking at how can AI read these logs, help us, assist us with some of the nuances of understanding these from the root cause, along with human in the loop. How can they augment our troubleshooting? And to an in the utopian era, how can it render itself for automatic remediation? That's the way AI ops has been chartered, and that is the formulation that we are working for some of our clients in large industries which generate so much of machine generated data that it is becoming pretty unbearable for a human to sit behind and do an eyeball glazing on that. When we look at any basic AIOps architecture, you would find a lot of event-driven logs coming and contributing it. Uh, what we do is we employ a learner. This is usually an ensemble model of an AI learner, where we look at the past behavior of looking at a pattern and identifying a particular issue. Then, once we see this particular trend brimming up with the log data, we automatically predict and suggest a preventive insight. This could be suggesting a run book to the SRE, or it could be suggesting a run book for a particular incident resolution. And that reduces pretty good deal in ticket reductions, timely recovery, and in a way, what we are rendering the system is an automatic way of smartly understanding where the problem is emanating, incident, automatically raise an incident, and in some ways run the run book all by themselves, and looking for a self-remediatory system across our IT infrastructure. That essentially is the AIOps architecture that we will be talking about. Now, where can this be applied? We have seen a various cases. I have been working with clients where we are looking at that at a very mediocre area where a meat cutting machine is now been attached to an sensory platform, and that sensory platform helps me detect the heating of the blade while cutting the meat, and then immediately raising an incident to change the blade. And then, I mean, these are very rudimentary ways. On our advanced ways, we are looking at completely managing the cloud infra, the on-prem infra, by looking at the application database and the data center logs, and quickly remediating incidences of capacity overflow, hyperscaling adjustments, and things like that. So this is where the industry is headed, and it has ceased to be an option anymore. It is becoming imperative that you make investments and move on with automation in operations with AI.
Right. So as we see that AI ops is being adopted for so many use cases, now is the time for a honest dialogue on how do we design responsible systems. So we start with answering the three important questions around these three categories, that is policy, technology, and process. So under policy, we must answer the question around, how the data is utilized. Is it compliant with the policy requirements around data? How the data would be used by the AI model? What is the decision we want the model to take? Coming to technology, we must bear in mind we must ask this question: that does the system track and monitor how the data is being used, uh, and does it also ensure all the security measures are in place? Coming to process, are we following a standard SDLC process for implementing this model, uh, and ensuring all the checks and balances are in place to the design pipeline? So as flashed on the screen is a standard AI model design pipeline, and which covers all the important aspects for a responsible model design. We always start with the purpose as to what outcome we want from our AI model. What is the automated decision we want it to show us? Then we move on to the sample stage where we explore the data sets, and then we create three data sets. One would be the test data set, one would be for training data set, and third is the validation data set. As a thumb rule, we keep 70% of the data set for training, 20% for testing, and 10% for validation. In this stage, we can induce bias, especially around from the sources of data, and then besides that, the sampling process that we follow. So there are good chances that data is skewed and is not consistently distributed. Third stage is choosing the model and analyzing. Here, once we have figured out the sampling and the purpose, we then select our model as applicable to our use case, and then we also analyze the data sources that are involved and the sampling process followed. This step is important from an audit perspective because we must document all these assumptions and considerations that we are taking care during our design phase. Then comes to the training phase, where we train the model. Here, there are again good chances of selection bias for a preferred tool. Besides that, which person trains the model can also induce bias depending on that person's persona and his or her thinking abilities. Then we move on to the validation part. Then again, this should be performed by an external group, and nobody from the core design team should be involved here. And then at this stage, we must ensure there is no included bias. Ultimately, it's a deployment stage where we deploy the model in production. But here, this step is very crucial because we must ensure that only an approved and thoroughly tested model should be deployed after carrying out all the checks and balances. Now, coming to the designing of the decision, this means that how do we explain what is the outcome of the model? This designing of the decision also starts from the purpose as to the outcome of the AI model should be in line with the purpose of the whole project. And then is the cost of decision. We must continuously review what would be the cost of decision on these two aspects. First is what would be the cost of the benefit that an improved and automated decision provides as against the cost of making an incorrect decision. Please remember, there's a very thin line between these two aspects, and then there's a trade-off involved. So this stage is very important. Then comes the manual override, where we look back and see how a human would have responded and how a human would have taken a decision for this particular problem. So this would help us in designing an automated decision, depending on the human response. And then is the legal and ethical considerations, which must be borne in mind around the policies applicable to the government, to the region, and the organization, followed by a thorough tech review, so that we document all these stages properly so that a model can be audited in the future.
So while Manisha laid out the principles of doing the design of our AIOps with consideration to ethics, meaningful viability, and being representative of the complete population, here are some of the ways in which we actually end up doing this. So if you were to redraw the crisp DM way of modeling, which Manisha just showed you, there are certain places where I and our team usually put some checks. The dataset metric is one where we do an extensive check if the population is thoroughly distributive. The pre-processing of algorithms makes sure that the prediction which we are getting of some of the rudimentary models is not skewed. In processing algorithms make sure that the data sets have been very clearly crafted so that while they are in process, they are not very despairingly distributed. And once we do this, we have a classifier metric which actually says that the results are fair, and the ML and the AI which is going behind the scenes to do this are completely explainable. I will later come back to you and show you some of the things where we actually take help from this. So this is one of this where we were working with a non-profit in US. For all the reasons, I will not be able to take the name of the client. And please bear in mind that we are not trying to racially discriminate or anything like that. I'm just trying to bring up certain nuances where, due to the lack of pre-processing or due to the lack of better collection of data, we started getting very unethical answers. There was about 0.8% of error rate in white men, whereas there was a 34.7% of error rate in dark-skinned women. This was simply not acceptable because the data collection, the data management, and the data representation prior to the experiment seems to follow an unethical and undistributed practice. And hence, the AIOps that go after that is nothing but a gradual pitfall. Similar to this, something like when we studied the policing practices of related to pre-crime algorithms, that this is about detecting where the next ATM heist could happen, where could be what are the communities where the uprise of violence might happen with respect to a particular policy churned out by the government and things like that. We actually look at color coding these areas. We give an extensional flavor to how this might spring up. And when we were looking at some of these, we were looking to see during the processes of managing these algorithms, we saw that either the programmers or the people who handled the data didn't have that sensitivity to the data, didn't have the correct ways of managing the data in the various forms and measures which needed to be percolated into the algorithms. That actually led to this very large gap between the policing records and the prediction of crime. So these are again very practical examples of where ethics in AIOps takes a most cornerstone than just the process.
So when it comes to being responsible, there's no single framework or policy. AI is embedded in our daily lives, and we can only build trustworthy systems if we bear in mind these AI principles. Fairness means the model should result in everyone being treated equally and in a fair manner. It should not discriminate against anyone, nor should it harm any individual. Robustness means once a model is deployed in a production environment, and as it is moved from a control environment to that scale, it should be able to give meaningful results for unseen data and unseen situations. It should also be robust against cyber attacks, ensuring the security of data of individuals. Next is lawfulness, as in the model should be compliant with all the regulatory requirements and laws and the policies around data, individuals, in laws applicable to a particular region, country, etc. And then besides that is human in the loop, depending the amount of involvement of a human being to take a decision. depends on the risk severity of that particular use case. Now, coming to explainability in AI, explainability means we should be able to explain and justify the outcome of the AI model. As flashed on the screen, you can see a graph that shows, a graph between the relation between transparency requirement and the criticality of a use case. I've put some examples there. For example, let's say biometrics or surveillance-based use cases. They are very risky and very high criticality use cases, and which is why the transparency requirement is high for such use cases. Here, I also want to bring up a fact that AI as a black box is a myth. No matter how complex an algorithm is, it should always be well understood. It just cannot be that we cannot deploy a model which is poorly understood. There are technologies and tools available in the industry that can be taken care of to probe such black box models. But as a best practice, we must quantify the outcome of such a model. And only then we should go ahead with the deployment, because it can impact so many individuals and so many, and so many things can be at stake if it does not give the intended decision. Transparency comprises of two types. One is a model working transparency, which is primarily around the code that is used, input and output data, and explainability of the prediction of the outcome. Second is the process transparency, where we should be able to, provide justification around the detailed process that is used for the development of the AI model, covering all the design assumptions, governance, and controls. Now you've seen till now you've seen the risks involved and the principles which should be borne in mind, the design aspects of the AI model. But to sum it up all together, these are the best practices which we must bear in mind when we have to mitigate such AI risks and ensure a very responsible AI model. Starting with data, we must ensure that data is not skewed, and it should be uniformly distributed, covering all the aspects of that particular use case scenario. And in turn, we should ensure the security of data. Coming to implementation, the decision should be explainable, as I had covered earlier. And then we can also look at human in the loop, depending on the criticality of that particular use case. And then there is audit. So like I mentioned before, in our design pipeline, every stage should be very well documented, all the assumptions during the design stage, all the sampling process, whatever things we have followed during a design pipeline should all be documented properly for auditing the model in future. Then comes the validation part, where we test the model for accuracy and its performance, and only approved models should be permitted to go in production. And all in all, while executing all these stages, all the regulations as applicable in a particular region, in a particular country, regulations and policies around data, all these things should be borne in mind, so that we ultimately develop a responsible AI model. So like this, we've seen that the potential of AI and AIOps is amazing. I mean, it can be applied, it is embedded in everyday life, but it is the responsibility of all the stakeholders which are involved and engaged with this technology to contribute to this responsible usage and deployment and development of AI technologies.
Well, we wanted to leave you with a lot of tools. Now that we have, in this short session, we established the principle, we established the need and the requirement for why AIOps and ethics go hand in hand. We wanted to also equip you with some of the tool sets that we ourselves use as industry leaders, and help you think about that. Now that Manisha has spoken about how do you ensure that your data sets are representative, how do you ensure that your algorithms are not biased, how do you ensure that the learning happens without the indifference to the community of data that has been sought from. These are a few of the very good tool sets that we ourselves have modified over. The LinkedIn Fairness Toolkit is one which I regularly use. Rather, I have actually a modified version of this, which is a proprietary version. But this is a good, very good LinkedIn resource. I would definitely ask everybody to go and take a look. The Fair ML establishes quite a good checks on the distributedness of data and on the bias of outcome. So these are also very good recommendations. And couple of papers that I read around these are pretty helpful for you too. I have one more tranche of goodies for you, Manisha. Now, this is another tranche that I keep referring to as a practice. So, as a practice for developing tools and accelerators in my own team, my team and us, we routinely commit to these accelerators, building of these accelerators. The fairness measure, the fair ML, Thymesis ML, these are very good plug and play. So whatever Manisha has spoken to you about as practices, these are the code level implementations of those practices. So you now have the mix of both the principles as well as the toolkit to make sure that you viably portray those principles into your code. I think Manisha and I will be very happy to take your questions from here on. We will be circulating the deck to you because there are a lot of resources and goodies that you can actually start trying out at your end. But you can now direct your questions. We'll be more than happy to help you if there are any. Okay, so
Right.
uh,
So thank you so much, Mrinag and Manisha. I believe we do have a time to take a couple of questions. So one interesting question, probably you already touched upon it during your talk, was that what should be an enterprise's roadmap for rolling out AI operations or for embracing AI operations, right? So if you can respectively take a shot at that.
the industry follows a methodology called CRISP-DM, Cross Industry Practice for Data Mining, right? That has been the practice which has been established, and pretty much every AI enterprise follows that. What we sense is that the CRISP-DM has to be now layered with a layer of ethical practices. So it needs to be responsive, explainable crisp DM now. And we have been putting a quite of a commit on some of the GitHubs and quite often contribution that we are making to enhance this cycle to make it more representative and more explainable AI for enterprises in their adoption journey. Manisha, anything that you would like to add?
Yeah, and then besides that, as covered in the presentation itself, the design pipeline that we had explained in detail, we can refer to those steps, right from defining the purpose, and then you then find out what data sets are applicable to solve your problem, and then and then how a human would solve that problem, and you try to automate that using all the technologies that we have. And then besides that, we should always define the problem correctly, because that is the most important stage, which in my experience I have seen that people don't define the things right in case of AIOps, and then they fail to cover the integrations of that particular application. If and we must bear in mind all those important components that make up that platform, and all the integrations that are feeding into that platform, to have a holistic AIOps setup for that. So I think that is another thing that should be borne in mind. And then besides that, of course, the compliance aspects of it. So the design pipeline, definitely we can refer to for executing to prepare our roadmaps around that.
Right. So I think, given that what I mentioned at the beginning, and I believe you as experts would also agree that this is fairly new. The adoption is really at a nascent level. So I think that's why some of the delegates in the audience, some of the delegates mentioned that if these slides could be shared. So I believe Mrinal also responded, and I'm not sure whatever is shareable. Probably in a shareable version, this could be made available to the larger audience so that they could potentially benefit from it.
Absolutely,
Definitely.
that's not a problem.
That's
We
no
can
problem.
we can share the shareable version of it, and yes.
Perfect. Perfect. So thank you so much, Mrinal. Thank you so much, Manisha, for taking out time, for putting in the effort of curating such a well-structured deck. Thank you so much for that. Thank you.
Thank
I
you
just
for the
want to I just
opportunity.
want to close by saying that AIOps is definitely new, yes, but then besides the technology part of it, it's more of a mindset change. And unless we don't have that mindset to really move from traditional way of doing things to this AI based things, that is more important execution more than the execution part of it. So yes, we would
Perfect.
have to embrace this technology with an open mindset.
Perfect. Perfect. Mrinal, I would also come to you because what are the concluding remarks, so to speak, or what is the one takeaway which the delegates have from this session?
I think inclusion of ethical standards and explainability is no more a choice. It is an imperative that the industry has to take care. Otherwise, there will be a lot of repercussions on the enterprise for making very, very bad quality decisions. This is becoming imperative, and it's only good that DSCI has recognized this need, and we are already started talking about it. Thank you for spreading the awareness
Thank,
around it.
thank you so much. Thank you.